Danny Frank for GNAT TV. This is the 100th anniversary of Ronald Reagan, President Ronald Reagan, and as a result of that timing, there's been a number of books that have recently come out about Ronald Reagan, chronicles of his life, different formats of different books. And this is in addition to several books that were previously published and written about his life and his career. And the other interesting dynamic right now is, as we're in another presidential campaign, it seems that so many candidates want to identify with Ronald Reagan or refer to Ronald Reagan, claim that Ronald Reagan would have supported their policies today. And to flesh all of this out and to give us some analysis, I've invited our resident Reagan expert, our resident authority on Ronald Reagan, who happens to be a resident of Bennington County, Vermont, and it's my privilege to have as a guest once again, Bill Henkel. Bill, thank you for coming out today. Bill, you had a distinguished career. You worked as a special assistant to President Nixon, and then a special assistant to President Gerald Ford, and then a special assistant to Ronald Reagan, and then you were elevated to the position of assistant to the president. And for those people, maybe you could explain the pecking order or nomenclature, because in a lot of people's minds, special assistant sounds a little more important than just assistant to the president. So maybe you could explain that.
A little Washington tip. The shorter the title, the more power you have. The president. If you put vice president, the secretary. There are deputy secretaries, assistant secretaries, and deputy assistant secretaries. So the longer the title, the less influence and power one has. In the White House, there are assistants to the president. So that's the lowest, staff assistants to the president. There are special assistants. There are deputy assistants. And then there are assistants to the president. I was the only assistant to the president in the Reagan White House that didn't have another function as part of my title. You have assistant to the president and chief of staff. James Baker, Ronald Reagan. You have
there was Howard Baker. Ken
Duberstein,
yeah.
Right.
So they were the chiefs of staff.
Yes, but
and then under the chief of staff,
there was normally a deputy chief of staff. There is one in the White House today. Historically, there have been. I was in a unique situation. I succeeded Michael Deaver, who was the deputy chief of staff.
And who went way back with Ronald
22
Reagan,
years,
right?
22 years. He was a key player in Reagan's gubernatorial election, in his 8 years as governor. Mike masterminded Reagan's public life after the governorship and in preparation to the president. He was extremely close to Mrs. Reagan and the president. But Don Regan, who I have a lot of admiration for, and I had actually worked with at Merrill Lynch.
And who was the President Reagan's first Secretary of the Treasury.
And Don craved influence and power. He was a success at Treasury. He was the architect of the tax reform, which was a major piece of legislation in Reagan's second term. But he realized that his influence, particularly in a second term, would not grow. And James A. Baker, who had been chief of staff, was exhausted. I mean, that's a 24/7, 365-day-a-year job. And so they masterminded a switch. And Don Reagan said to me, he inherited, when Mike left, my appointment to replace him was a decision of the President and Mrs. Reagan.
Big shoes to fill.
And Michael Deaver.
Right.
And the reason ultimately I quickly found out was the astrologer. That Mike influenced the President's schedule every day. He was getting direction from Mrs. Reagan on astrological input into the President's schedule. Quickly, what Mrs. Reagan's astrologer was doing was judging from the stars what were good days, say for a press conference or the State of the Union address, going outside the White House into public events. A major thing that Joan Quigley did was make judgments as to what were going to be safe days or bad days. And Michael had to translate that input into the scheduling process. I came in and I had to do the same. The situation with Mike was that he informed, without Mrs. Reagan knowing it, James A. Baker, the chief of staff. So there was no conflict there. When Don Reagan and Baker switched jobs, I had been designated to replace Mike. And that decision was predicated on Mrs. Reagan and the President feeling that particularly she had confidence in me to do what Mike had done for her. The problem was Don announced to me right after we met, shortly after he got the position of assistant to the President and Chief of Staff, that he did not need a deputy Chief of Staff. I don't need a deputy. You can perform all the functions, but I don't want to have someone think that I need a deputy. So I then became the only assistant to the President, I like to say, for nothing.
But you were the gatekeeper of sorts. You were in charge of President Reagan's schedule.
Yes.
For a period of time,
yes.
Several years, right?
Yes.
So.
Yes.
And obviously the importance of the trust that the Reagans had in you.
Absolutely. And it was a great honor, something that I accepted, and it was difficult at times. Then once I can show you that in Don Reagan's book, he announces to the world the reality of an astrologer, and in that attributes it to me, in that he even says in the book, poor Bill, I was giving him such a hard time for inexplicable changes in the President's schedule without my permission. And there was a lot of tension growing. And then I went to Mike Deaver and Mrs. Reagan and said, this isn't going to work. He has got me on a short leash, and I think he has to be brought into it. So Michael Deaver and Don, I didn't attend that meeting. They met together, and then again, shortly after that, I got a call from Don saying, "Hey, Bill, I'm sorry. If I'd only known, I wouldn't have given you so much trouble." So that's my story.
Bill Henkel, before we get into a critique of some of these new books that are out, and some of them are on the bestseller lists as well, about Ronald Reagan, I want your take on that proposition I just laid out a few minutes ago about how many of the presidential candidates want to embrace Ronald Reagan and cite Ronald Reagan. Why are they doing that?
Well, I think the latest books, another thing that happens after 20 or 25 years out of office is the declassification of a lot of very super secret documents, and a lot of stuff has been coming out that adds substance to the strong hand that Ronald Reagan had over his presidency. He was not passive. He architected, through a series of what they call the National Security Decision Directives, NSDDs, the architecture that led to the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1982. And you see in these and then other things that have come out how much in control he was of the big picture things. And I think it's clear to say that Ronald Reagan was a transformative president is a fact, and it's not challenged now. And that is huge, because I think in the 20th century there's probably been only 3 transformative presidents: the 2 Roosevelts and then Ronald Reagan. Others came close, but no one turned a country around in 4 short years from 20% inflation, days of malaise, a deterioration of the American dream. And fast forward, I think that's a real subject here. And I don't think any of the real candidates are really addressing how do we restore in the public the spirit of America that future generations will do better than that. I think Ronald Reagan is great. He's recognized for being transformative, and his accomplishments speak for themselves.
Bill Henkel, let's discuss this book. Let's start with the Bill O'Reilly book, which has gotten a lot of attention. Bill O'Reilly is doing a lot of interviews on it. It's on the bestseller list. It's one of several books that he's written. And your critique on this book from a person who spent a lot of time directly with the President of the United States, Ronald Reagan.
While you're holding that, there's a subtitle on this book that says, "The Violent Assault That Changed a Presidency." That's a pretty bold statement. Reading the book closely, I can say unequivocally that he never makes that case. He cites, if I can go to the index, Danny.
The index of Bill O'Reilly's book. Yeah.
There is a subject line, mental and physical decline. Now, there are 2 lines of pages on there. I have looked at, while he was president, and I was a party to these things, he cites an incident of a meeting with the speechwriters. There's about 8 or 9 of them, and including Peggy Noonan. There's some pretty egotistical people in the speechwriting staff. And he had gotten a new hearing aid, and so he seemed befuddled, and it was confusing.
And this was what year, approximately?
1983.
Okay.
That's still, close to the Henkel incident. The other incident they put out, what happened in Louisville, Kentucky, at the first presidential debate between Reagan and Mondale. I had the role of being, then the debates were controlled by the League of Women Voters, a group of vipers, and I was Ronald Reagan's second, and I was negotiating with a woman lawyer who was representing that, and so I was intimately involved in that event. It was in a theater, and I was in the makeup room where the actors changed, and that's where we watched the debate. right off stage. And Reagan was over-prepared. David Stockman had crammed him with things. And, he got confused. And it was a terrible performance. And it was horrible because our Mondale's team was in the next, room, and they were cheering, and I mean, we're all, wow. So that wasn't a mental lapse. It was a preparation overdose. And then the other incident I was intimately involved in. And that's a cabinet meeting on March 2nd, 1986. Shortly after Howard Baker, the Senate Majority Leader, had replaced Don Reagan. In many ways, it was like a palace coup. And I was very much involved in the middle of that. And they had commissioned, and over a period of time of 2 days, that a gentleman by the name of Jim Cannon,
Yes.
who had been a Rockefeller key aide, had been very close to Rockefeller as the vice, when he was vice president, was a Washington player. And Howard Baker asked him to run around the West Wing and interview Reagan's senior staff. And I had known Jim over the years, and so I think I could say pretty proudly that the president and his schedule, his performances, and everything else publicly and in the office, in cabinet meetings, in NSC meetings, and all of these things, he was fine. Other people, and then he put...
And obviously, this is a grueling job for anyone.
Oh, absolutely.
For any
but
person.
I'm up close and personal, and I see this, and so for Bill O'Reilly to make the thesis or have a thesis that John Hinckley's Devastator bullet had a lasting and impact on Reagan's mental and physical health, and with the inception, whenever that was, and he has nothing in there as to when that might be, that Reagan he describes as being inattentive, leaving the office early and going and watching TV shows up in the residence. I can tell you unequivocally, as someone that was around that, had my office in the West Wing, had daily interaction with him, he was not going. And the irony is, if he's going to be going to the residence, there's only one way to go. You come out the Oval Office, you go, there's the colonnade which borders the Rose Garden, and right there he has to make a turn, and that's where the press is. And the press are not, sequestered in the press room. I mean, it's false. It's just that there is no proof of that, and I categorically deny that he was leaving the office to watch TV, soap operas.
That's Bill O'Reilly's book, Killing Reagan. There's another book that's out now, I think is on the bestseller list as well. It's written by Tom Mallon, who's a famous author, American author, and it's called Finale, a novel of the Reagan years, and it's fictionalized based on true incidents. And Bill, your critique on this book?
Again, it's excellent reading. He's a terrific author, writer. Pace is good, everything. There's some really wonderful insights into Mrs. Reagan's psyche and thinking, her love for Ronald Reagan and putting up with the ranch. And there's a huge amount of stuff about the astrologer and Mrs. Reagan's role in terms of protecting the image and welfare of the president. So there's some good stuff in here.
It's undisputed that she was enormously influential and had a control of to some degree over
Yeah.
the president, right?
Yes, but I think it's wrong to say that she was making substantive decisions in terms of critical appointments, signing legislation, the domestic policy program, the National Security Council. She told me in the beginning how she got into astrology. As an actress, her relationship with Ronald Reagan, an actor, she was saying that a number of Hollywood stars used an astrologer because the film business is very ephemeral. You can have a good film, then you could have a bust. It can have a dramatic impact on your career. So a lot of them used an astrologer to say, should I take this role and stuff like that. So generally, her purpose with the astrologer was, if he was going to be going out and doing a press conference, is that a good day? Are there better days astrologically to have a press conference, or the State of the Union address? And then also, another factor was the safety of the president. And it was briefed by her as part of my transition up in the residence. She is telling me, and this has been public too, is when she got to the hospital after he'd been shot, as she said, I am the daughter, was a very eminent surgeon. I know, and I could tell he was pale as a ghost. He was dying. And Bill, I had been told by the Secret Service that day, because this was a bad day, that the president should not be out in public. And the Secret Service had come to her and said, well, we're going to the Washington Hilton, but we put a tent up. And the limousine will drive up, get in there, and he will not be out in public. Well, on the way out, they had moved the car, that short walk, and that had happened. And so she was emphatic to me that Joan had warned us. I had made a change. If I had prevailed, he wouldn't have gone to that speech at the Washington Hilton. I want you to understand this is very important to me. So, again, and then there's one other little insight that I think is a real positive. Mrs. Reagan was with the president, as she was every evening, and he's working on his diary. He was a diarist. And he tells her, I had a wonderful talk with Margaret Thatcher today. She called me specifically to tell me her impressions of Mikhail Gorbachev, the new General Secretary of the Soviet Union. And she was glowing about, he's different. Who did Mrs. Reagan call the next day? Joan Quigley, the astrologer, says, tell me about him astrologically. And from that moment on, Joan said that these two guys have a destiny together. There's a whole bunch of stuff. It's mumbo jumbo to me, and I think that she consistently prevailed with the president on the sidelines about what are you doing to try and re-engage the Soviets. So I think she played a significant role. She, Joan, and Mrs. Reagan in that positive.
So Tom Fallon's book, good reading, but you gotta view it as fiction.
Yeah,
right?
and yeah. I mean, there's a character in here, Anders Little, who's an NSC guy, who's a protege of Jeane Kirkpatrick, the UN ambassador, and Richard Nixon. He has a whole series of stuff about what he did. Anders, who's a fictional character, at Reykjavik. He rode on Air Force One on the flight from Washington to Iceland. I was on that plane. Mallon is wrong that a person at his title and level within the NSC would be on Air Force One. That's wrong. And there were other little typical, things that were just dead incorrect. So I had some, that's where I started to push back. And then he has a bunch of characters that really have nothing to do with Ronald Reagan. So that said, it was still a good read.
So, Bill, in our few remaining minutes, I want to do justice to Donald Reagan's book, For the Record. And again, you worked directly under Donald Reagan in the White House in serving President and Mrs. Reagan.
So. Just real quick, I was going to show you some stuff about the astrologer. And Don basically in this book reveals that I was the reason that he learned about the astrologer. And so again, I think that's important. But before I go, I want to say that I have an explanation as to why Ronald Reagan's second term wasn't up to the excellent outcomes and quality of the first. And that is the departure of James Baker, the departure of Mike Deaver, and the fact that Donald Reagan was no Jim Baker. He was not a politician. He was a very successful businessman. If there were obstacles, you plow them over, and he did not, I think, serve the president as in any equal capacity as James Baker. Michael Deaver was irreplaceable, and people are going to say, "Oh, do you feel guilty?" No, he had 22 years with the Reagans. He was a master of public relations. He was very good at scoping out events.
He also went out under some scrutiny too, right?
Oh, sure.
Legal
yeah.
conflicts that
he was an alcoholic.
into. Right.
There's a scene. I don't know if this is true. Mallon has Mrs. Reagan going out to a alcohol rehabilitation thing run by the Jesuits up in Maryland. It could have happened, but that interaction and stuff like that was real. It was fascinating if it happened. But again, it's a good read.
So, but Donald Reagan's book, you feel is accurate?
Yes,
and,
yes. But it doesn't address the fact that he was not James Baker. And then there's another thing here. This is an article, a major article in the Washington Post by Lou Cannon, who was the Washington Post, chief White House reporter, was probably the most preeminent biographer of the president. And the headline is Howard Baker, and then in quotes, solution, now viewed as a problem. And then this is after 8 months, and it's a very negative article. And Howard Baker is the one that's going home early, is totally frustrated. It was two different worlds. The Senate, where compromise, conciliation, all of the techniques of legislation are absolutely alien to an executive role in terms of running the country.
Bill, before we close out, I'd just like you to hold up this document that you brought.
This is something that I think if anyone questions Ronald Reagan's activity, this is every month from January of '82 until March of '88 of his activities, of which I participated in all but about 6 months of. And anyone that questions, just look at the dark. This man was active every day. If he was in California at the ranch, he got his security briefing. He had packages. I was up at the ranch a lot, and every morning, he got a dossier of information that had to be read. So presidents are 24/7, and Ronald Reagan performed admirably that entire time.
Bill, there's all of these books that are out now that are very popular on and make good reading, timed to the 100th anniversary of Ronald Reagan, and I want to thank you so much for your very insightful analysis of President Reagan, being an eyewitness right up close and personal, and it's great that you're a resident of Bennington County, southern Vermont. So,
Well, I like a fellow traveler, and I think Danny and I have, some of the same insights. So it's a pleasure to participate on your show.
So this is Danny Frank for GNAT TV. Bill Henkel, thank you for being with us.
My pleasure.